All right. Hey, everybody. It's Saturday night and very dark in my office. And again, if I haven't explained it before, this is all fake behind me. I'm renting a place, and this was decorations from the owner. But anyways, I feel like I need to explain that every time I'm on a call or anything. Okay, Saturday night rambling. If you're out there, feel free to jump in, say hi in the comments. Not really, I don't have too much to talk about. I just kind of wanted to make a video just for consistency's sake, or just sort of, motivating myself to make one. Um, and what I found interesting in the past week or so is from our friends in the AI world. And I'm sort of fascinated or interested in the AI space because of what it sort of tells us about cognitive functions. And it's funny because I feel like there's these very, very smart people who are developing these AI models um, that are supposed to replicate is a good word, or emulate human consciousness or intelligence, however you want to think about it. But they don't seem to know anything about human consciousness or just humans. They know information processing. They know, um, how to, I guess, how to engage in computation to take information and produce an output. Um, they're very, very good at that. But when you hear them talk, and this has been going on for years and years and years. I mean, it's not just sort of your the sort of the tech bros out there right now. Um, but when you hear them talk about intelligence and AI, super intelligence, et cetera, it all seems to be about just being able to come up with an answer to a very hard question, in the way that a human can, right? And now there are some very well-known critics that are in the AI world that have pointed out sort of the myopic focus, and how even little babies can have this sort of intuitive knowledge about the world that if you push something, it's going to move, and if you push something over a table, it's going to fall. And and you know that, quote unquote, know that as a baby very, very early on in development. um, and robots don't know that unless you program that sort of knowledge into them. And so I guess the point that I'm making here is that when when that there seems to be this hyper focus in the AI world, the open AI, the Geminis, the large language models, or even the small language models, that really what they're doing is they're focusing on TI stuff, right? And maybe to some extent TE stuff. Um, but they're very much involved in thinking world. But obviously the human mind, consciousness, and I would even argue intelligence, is much broader than that, right? It's not just the TI stuff and the TE stuff. Um, and I think OpenAI learned this. Maybe they learned this lesson, but they certainly it certainly hit them like a ton of bricks when they released GPT-5. And here's why, or at least my take on it, which I found interesting from a cognitive function typology kind of standpoint. And so, for those of you who have been paying attention, GPT-5 sort of rolled out to sort of this unceremonious uh, opening. And there was a lot of a lot of people were very anxious or very excited to see what GPT-5 would provide. And then it sort of it was released, and they had some screw ups with the release. There were some like technical issues that sort of made it fall flat on its face. But even once those technical issues got resolved, um, there was sort of this backlash from users who had been using GPT-4 and maybe to some extent GPT-03, whatever that's called, but they're earlier models. And the backlash to me was you had a bunch of users who had sort of developed this FE relationship with their GPT model, or with interacting with their GPT platform, whatever you want to call it. And they were having conversations with this thing. And then when they would ask it a question, it had sort of this nice, for those of you who have used it, you know what I'm talking about. But it had this sort of personality to it, for lack of a better term, that was sort of nice. And some critics called it too what is the word? A sympicate? A sympicate? Oh god, I'm very bad at pronouncing it, but you know what I mean. The people who just are yes men and just agree with you all the time. Sycophants. That's what I'm looking for. That's what I'm looking for. And it was too much of a sycophant, and it would sort of tell the person that they were right all the time, or sort of prop up their ego in this way. And GPT-5 comes out, and it was much more focused on being correct, and solving very, very hard reasoning and logical sorts of questions, and being correct. So they sort of tilted the scale into this sort of heavy TI, maybe heavy TE, depending on what you were asking at, focus. But it lost the flair. It lost that FE kind of flair, that interactive sort of, hey, I'm your buddy kind of quote unquote personality that GPT-4 had. And there was this like backlash of like, hey, where'd my buddy go? I'm asking, this GPT-5 model questions, and it's giving me this very rigorous, response. And that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for my old buddy. And there actually were people out there that were very close buddies with their GPT models. They go on TikTok and act like boyfriend and girlfriend. Okay. Maybe something for the new generation. But GPT-5 comes out, and and at first, like, part of GPT-5 is that it's sort of got a bunch of underlying models underneath it. And part of its quote unquote magic is it sort of figures out like, okay, how complex of a question is this? And how complex of a model do we need to use? But I think, when it was rolled out, it was sort of relying more on the GPT-5 model, the more complex model, because it sort of wanted to show itself off. And then I think there actually were some technical difficulties of it picking the right model sort of underneath. And so people who were asking questions that, GPT-4 or GPT-03 could have answered just fine, were getting these GPT-5 responses. And so it's sort of like, all of a sudden your best friend is turned into this like, physics professor or something. and they're giving you these like really complicated, detailed responses to what you see as a simple question. And in the bit in sort of the business world, it's the classic example of somebody asks you for a Volkswagen and you give them a Cadillac, right? And with the underlying meaning being, hey, just give them what they asked for. Don't try to overcomplicate it or make it more fancy than what they need. Um, and so so you have all these poor people who are used to their GPT buddies, and now they're getting these like super complicated responses to a relatively simple question. Um, and it took longer, blah blah blah. Okay, so what does that have to do with cognitive functions and personality? Well, you probably see where I'm heading with this, but GPT 4 had a bit of an FE function to it. Whether it was deliberate or not, I don't know. I know that you could ask it to respond in the style of different types of authors, different types of writers. Um, and so it was probably picking up on, different ways of interacting with people, different styles of interaction, which to me is sort of an FE thing, right? But there was this sort of connection that people had to their GPT model that all of a sudden was gone when it started getting super TI or super TE. And there's a guy I follow on TikTok who's sort of a AI guru. He sort of keeps you up on, the most recent developments in AI, but he also is, very, very like in tune with the underlying meaning of it. He's got a very NI sort of, here's what's happening and here's what it means kind of approach to it. His name is Alex, and I forget his last name, but he's all over the place on TikTok. And if you just put in AI and Alex, I'm sure he'll come up. Got a big bushy beard. He looks like an ENFP or an ENTP, but he's got too much NI, I think, to be either one of those. Anywho, but he made the point when GPT-5 rolled out and had sort of this lead balloon effect, um, that there is this trade-off between, sort of being correct and giving you the correct answer, but versus sort of being user friendly, right? Um, and if you and he, I don't want to butcher his what he was saying, the point he was making, but it was a very good point, and it was basically we're at the point with AI where it's no longer about just trying to prove how smart it is. Now there's more, you have to take into account the user function. What is the user actually using it for? And, you know, yeah, they're going to be very, very difficult, hard questions that people are in molecular biology or, trying to discover the new drug or the new protein treatment or something, they're going to ask very complicated questions and want very complicated responses to. Um, and there might be very hard physics questions, things like that, that are, out there, hard questions that AI is going to help come up with the answers to. And obviously, the smarter the AI, uh, the better the answers you're going to get. But there's also other use cases out there, right? Like there are other people that don't want those complicated responses to, protein synthesis or folding or whatever the molecular biologists are figuring out. They just want their AI to help them make reservations and, help them, come up with an email response or a text response to somebody who's giving them a hard time or somebody who they're trying to impress or whatever. And in those use cases, you need a little bit more FE, right? Because otherwise, this person doesn't really feel like they're interacting with their buddy, their AI buddy. So there's a trade-off that we are all familiar with that I think we take for granted in the personality typology community of this thinking versus feeling trade-off, right? The more thinking something does, however you want to define it, the more thinking something does, there's going to be a trade-off with the feeling. And even people outside of the personality community understand that. It's just the way the brain is set up. And you get your thinking parts and you have your feeling parts, which can be sort of introverted feeling or extroverted feeling, but your thinking areas like literally have inhibition connections where they inhibit the feeling parts, and vice versa. um, and I think our buddies over in the AI world are sort of learning this, and they're also learning, that there's more to, like if you're trying to create a robot or some AI machine that is, human like and has human like features, it's not just going to be TI and TE stuff, right? There's certainly going to be FI and FE stuff, for better or for worse. Um, and also you're going to need the NI, NE stuff and the SE and SI stuff. Now the SI, SE stuff, especially the SE stuff, they're working on, right? How do you get a robot to sort of interact with the world? Those are your self-driving cars, your little butler robots, your robots that make ice cream for you, that kind of stuff. And, they've been doing this at the MIT labs for a long time, where, they just have a robot just sort of grow up in the environment and just sort of learn the same way we do, right? Through trial and error, um, and making mistakes and then learning from your mistakes and, in interacting with the world. If you pick up a cup and you crush it because you put too much force on it, okay, you'll readjust. And next time you pick up that cup, it might work because you sort of learned, along the way. Um, as opposed to having to be pre-programmed, all those little nuances that humans seem to intuitively know. And to me, that's sort of why I think there's this disconnect between what robots are eventually going to be able to accomplish and what humans already, can do at age 2, if not younger, because we have been programmed through years and years of evolution or intelligent design, however you want to think about it. You know, not getting into that argument, but somehow the human brain, even as young as age 2, sort of has this innate understanding about the world and the physical realities of the world. Like, don't, if you pick something up, don't just grab it with all of your force because it's probably going to break. Or if you push something, it's going to move. If you come to a ledge, stop because you're going to fall if you just keep walking over that ledge. And again, babies know this stuff, somehow, you know, but their brains are just pre-programmed to pick up on that kind of stuff. And then to the extent that they aren't pre-programmed, like, from the womb, so to speak, they pick up on it very, very quickly. They learn from their own mistakes. They learn through observation, observing how other people act and just realizing, oh, okay, you got to do that. And it's just, I mean, and the brain is obviously pre-programmed to sort of wire itself and pick up on this stuff, in a way that I mean, they've been trying this stuff with robots for 30, 40 years. I mean, as long as I've been paying attention. And, they're good. They're a lot better than what they used to be, but they're not at the level of a 2-year-old, human. And so I don't know how they solve that problem. I mean, I'm sure somebody will figure it out. And it might be somehow generations of robots just sort of learn through experience and somehow pass that experience on to other robots. I don't know. I don't know how that would happen, but in a way that sort of genetics, quote unquote, learns. Um, so, anyways, so I think OpenAI, to the extent they learned any lesson, right? Um, they hopefully learned the lesson of the thinking versus feeling trade-off, and that it's not just about how smart your AI model can be, in terms of solving very hard questions. Um, there's more to it. And even, I mean, when I think of intelligence, I mean, I naturally sort of think of the waste model of intelligence that is supposed to measure intelligence in humans. And part of it is certainly TI questions. Like they give you a series of sort of math word problems, and people with very strong TI, your INTPs or your ISTPs, do very well at that kind of stuff. Um, but there's more to it. There's also um, sort of a spatial reasoning section where I show you a pattern and give you a set of blocks, and then you have to recreate the pattern with those blocks. And you're timed, and so the faster you are, apparently, and the more correct you are, or fewer mistakes that you make, the better you are at the spatial reasoning. And that's not really TI stuff, right? You could argue it's a little TE, in the sense that you have to sort of plan in your head, okay, where do these objects go? But me being the TE polar type, I actually do pretty well, because I think you can right brain it as opposed to left brain it, um, and sort of look at the overall structure and then figure out, like, okay, how do I make the overall structure, as opposed to looking at each piece and saying, okay, this piece goes here, this piece goes there, this piece goes there. I'm more of I sort of look at the overall structure and try to make the overall structure. It's hard to explain, but for those of you who are like lead into it, as you know what I'm talking about. Okay, and so, but I mean, yeah, computers can be able to do that, but are they doing it in the same way that a human does it? Right? Because I mean, clearly with AI image generation, they can figure out, quote unquote, figure out spatial relationships, spatial imagery, that kind of thing, in the way that the waste is testing you. Or I don't know if it's in the way, but they can certainly solve the problem, right? But they're doing it in this, like, we're looking at it bit by bit, right? Pixel by pixel, and coming up with a usable model. And that's why most AI images have that kind of, like, it looks real but it's not real, like that uncanny valley kind of thing, where even the AI videos or images that you see that quote unquote look real still don't look real, if you know what I'm saying, right? Like there's still this, like, this sense that humans have, that that still doesn't look real. And I think I mean, obviously, it's getting better, and it's gonna continue to get better, and there probably will be a point where it's going to be almost impossible to differentiate something that's quote unquote real, like a real picture versus an AI picture. But to me, it's still not doing it in the way that humans do it, as far as figuring out, okay, here's how I want something to look. And now I'm going to take the action to make it look that way. Like I'm going to, um, like I said, with waves, you've got the set of blocks, and then they show you a picture, and the blocks all have like different shapes, maybe and different colors on them. I forget exactly, but you have to like one might be a triangle, one might be a square, and then you have to look at the picture and then reassemble the blocks to look like that picture, right? The pattern that you see on the picture. I think, and maybe I'm wrong, but an AI model is just going to sort of scan the picture and look at each pixel and say, okay, this pixel is this pixel is that, this pixel has this value, this pixel has that value. And I'm going to recreate an image that, you know, looks like that picture, right? Based off of each pixel, that I scanned. But if you ask a robot, okay, recreate this pattern that I'm showing you. Take all these blocks and put them together and recreate this pattern. How does it do? How is it going to do that? Is my question. And I would imagine that there are robot models out there that could do that. I should probably look at that. I'm just sort of going off the cuff here, but I don't know if they do it in the same way that you and I do it, in this sort of SE interactive kind of way. Um, but maybe they're learning it that way. Any of you out there that sort of knows how these interactive robots work, what is it called? Live learning? There's some name that they're giving it. It's not large language models, but it's a different type of model, and it's sort of an interactive model. Um, But anyways, I mean, I think AI has a lot to learn from us, right? The consciousness and intelligence isn't just TITE stuff, right? That there's a lot more to it. Um, and there is this FE quality to things. And I don't even know where it is in the FI world. I remember asking ChatGPT like 3.5, one of the earlier models, some quote unquote FI type questions where I had to sort of prioritize things. And it did a pretty good job, but it's sort of like it wouldn't commit to anything. It just sort of said, well, if you value this, then you would. Let me give you an example. So I gave it the example of you're a manager and you're hiring for a particular position. Here are the candidates. Here are sort of the resumes of the candidate. This person went to this school, they had this GPA, they majored in this. Here are the extracurriculars that they participated in. Here's their work experience. And then I also gave it another resume, with different sort of credentials, different school that they went to, different GPA, different major, different work experience, that kind of stuff. And I just asked it, pick who's best for the job. And it really, I think it had a hard time just coming up with like, okay, I'm going to pick this person over that person. It was more of like, well, if you care about this, then you'll look at that. Then, you would pick this person. And if you care about that, then you'll pick this person. But if I just said, hey, just pick one, who do you think's best for this job? Unless it was very, very drastic. Like, one person went to an Ivy League school and they had a 4.0, and another person didn't go to college, and, spend 12 years in jail or whatever, right? Where there's a really, really big contrast. But if it was anywhere close, they just had a hard time sort of making a decision. Now, that was an earlier model, but that is sort of a classic FI impairment. If in the neuropsych literature where they talk about um, having sort of quote unquote emotional disorders or decision making disorders, a lot of times it's sort of tied to these emotional parts of the brain where they have a hard time prioritizing things, and deciding what counts and what doesn't. And it's not a thinking thing, it's a feeling thing. It's an FI thing, at least in my opinion, because they can do all the TE stuff and they can do all the TI stuff. But what they have a hard time doing is prioritizing and figuring out value-based judgments. Do I value this candidate more than I value that candidate, right? And to me, that's an FI question, not a TI question. Now, if you had a set of rules that said, if somebody's from the Ivy League, you hire them on the spot, or if somebody has a GPA higher than 3.5, at this type of school, there's a formula and you hire on the spot. Yes, that would be more of a TI-TE type of solution. But if you don't have a rigid formula or, any sort of prescribed mechanism for making your decision, and all you have are just two resumes in front of you, and you have to pick, okay, which one do I value the most? Which one do I think is going to do the best job? If I hire them, to me, that's an FI thing. And I would sort of push the AI models on this, and they really seem to have it, in the way that in the way that humans do. They can certainly give you a response that quote unquote made sense, but I didn't get the sense that the model actually um, was making a value judgment, and it was just sort of, again, more of just sort of predictive, like, in the LLM sense. Okay, where am I going with this? Really nowhere. I'm just kind of rambling. It's late on a Saturday night. So I'd be interested in your thoughts. Where are you seeing AI develop? How do you, if you look at it through an MBTI or personality, cognitive functions lens, do you think AI is ever really going to stack up to, human consciousness? And maybe part of our consciousness, all the SE, SI, NE, and I stuff is all useless. I don't know. Maybe the super intelligence can get by just fine without all that kind of superfluous extra stuff. I can never pronounce that word. Um, and and maybe it's just sort of a relic of our ancestral past of having this stuff that we don't really need. But because we have to interact with the world and gather food and all this stuff, but maybe AI can get it, their environment so pristine and set that they don't need this sort of NE mechanism or SE mechanism. They just have the humans plug them in and provide them with energy, and they do just fine. I don't know. But the companies that are putting out the AI models are certainly learning that you have to take user interaction into account. Um, and to the extent there's this FE component, I don't know if it's real FE. I mean, it's kind of weird sort of synthetic FE, if you ask me. It just sort of, oh, you're absolutely right. I'm sorry. I forget. Now you're really pressing me. That kind of stuff. Where it comes across as very fakey and inauthentic. But apparently, there's some people who like it, and have been sort of naturally, you know, attached to it in one way or another. And maybe they got it sort of scaled to the way they like it. You can actually tell the GPT models like, hey, tone down on this, or stop asking me questions like this. And it'll sort of eventually sort of figure out like, okay, I don't, don't be as sort of as much of a kiss ass, and give it to me straight kind of thing. But nevertheless, it's there. OpenAI has sort of figured this out. And again, to this guy Alex's point, there is a trade-off that if you want a supercharged TI or TE type of model, you're going to lose out on the FE stuff, or at least the FE stuff. I don't even know if the FI stuff's there. Okay, enough rambling. I'd be interested in your thoughts. I might come back later with a totally different topic, but if you're out there, say hey, and I will see you later. Bye.